She was lost in the deadly heart of Texas, betrayed by the man sworn to protect her, until a shadow emerged from the rocks, towering, silent, and unlike anything she expected. What happened next changed her life forever. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Texas sun burned mercilessly across the endless prairie, turning the September air into waves of shimmering heat that distorted the horizon. Sarah Bennett gripped the wooden seat of the supply wagon as it bounced over another rut in the barely visible trail, her knuckles white beneath the dust that coated everything. She was 23 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and striking green eyes that reflected both determination and growing unease. Her calico dress, once a cheerful blue pattern, now hung heavy with the grime of 3 days' travel from San Antonio toward the new settlement of Fredericksburg. Beside her sat Jack Mercer, the cowboy her father had hired to escort her and the precious medical supplies to the frontier town where she was to work as a nurse. Jack was a lean man with a weathered face and cold gray eyes that never quite met hers when he spoke. Something about him had troubled Sarah from the beginning, but her father had assured her that Mercer knew these lands better than anyone, that he could navigate the dangerous territory where Comanche raiding parties still roamed, and outlaws preyed on solitary travelers. "How much longer until we reach Fredericksburg?" Sarah asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled between them for the past hour. Her throat was parched, and she eyed the remaining water canteen with concern. Jack spat tobacco juice over the side of the wagon before answering. "Another day, maybe 2. Depends on whether we run into trouble." His tone was casual, almost indifferent, which only deepened Sarah's apprehension. She noticed they had veered off the main trail some time ago, heading into increasingly rough terrain, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. "This doesn't look like the route we discussed with my father. Shouldn't we be following the established road?" "The established road is where trouble finds you, Miss Bennett," Jack replied, his mouth twisting into something that might have been a smile but looked more like a sneer. "I'm taking us a safer way, through the canyon country. Trust me." But Sarah didn't trust him. Not anymore. Not since she'd caught him going through her belongings the previous night when he thought she was asleep. Not since she'd noticed how his hand always rested on his pistol when he looked at her. Not since she'd realized that the supplies in the wagon were worth a small fortune on the frontier. Far more than her father had paid Jack for this journey. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the landscape grew more rugged. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the vegetation became sparse and hostile. Jack guided the wagon into a narrow canyon, its walls rising steeply on either side, blocking out much of the remaining daylight. "We'll make camp here," Jack announced abruptly, pulling the horses to a stop in a small clearing surrounded by boulders. "Get down and start gathering firewood." Sarah climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the long day of travel. She moved toward a cluster of dead mesquite branches, her mind racing. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The location was defensible, yes, but it was also isolated, cut off from any potential help. She glanced back at Jack, who was unhitching the horses with deliberate slowness, his eyes tracking her movements. "Mr. Mercer, I've been thinking," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. "Perhaps we should continue on a bit further. There's still some daylight left, and I'd really like to reach Fredericksburg as soon as possible. The supplies I'm carrying include medicines that are desperately needed." Jack straightened up, and the last pretense of civility dropped from his face like a discarded mask. "You think I don't know what you're carrying, Miss Bennett? Your daddy made sure everyone in San Antonio knew about the valuable medical supplies heading to Fredericksburg. Morphine, quinine, surgical instruments, all worth more than I'd make in 5 years of honest work." He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "And you, a pretty little nurse, all alone out here. I'd say I picked the perfect escort job." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept hidden in her skirt pocket. "My father will come looking for me. People know I'm with you." "Your father thinks you're safe with trustworthy Jack Mercer," he mocked, advancing toward her. "And by the time anyone figures out different, I'll be in Mexico with enough money to live like a king, and you'll be, well, That depends on how cooperative you decide to be. Terror gave Sarah's legs strength she didn't know she possessed. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on loose stones as she scrambled toward the canyon wall. Behind her, she heard Jack's curse and the sound of his pursuit. The canyon seemed to close in around her, offering no escape, no shelter. She spotted a narrow crevice between two boulders and squeezed through, scraping her arms on the rough rock, her breath coming in desperate gasps. "You can't run forever," Jack's voice echoed through the canyon. "There's nowhere to go, Sarah. Make this easy on yourself." Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone, trying to control her ragged breathing. Through the gap in the rocks, she could see Jack searching, his pistol now drawn. The sun was sinking rapidly behind the canyon rim, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. She knew that once darkness fell, her chances of escape would diminish to nothing. She waited until Jack moved past her hiding spot, then slipped out and ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the canyon system. Her lungs burned, and her dress caught on thorny bushes tearing the fabric, but she didn't stop. The canyon branched, and she chose the left passage without thinking, driven only by the primal need to survive. Behind her, Jack's shouts grew more distant, but she knew he would find her trail. The man was an experienced tracker. That was why her father had hired him in the first place. The irony would have been laughable if she weren't so terrified. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing against a sandstone wall as the last light faded from the sky. The temperature was already dropping, and she had no water, no supplies, no weapon beyond her small knife. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, trying to conserve warmth as the desert night descended with shocking speed. Stars emerged in impossible numbers across the darkening sky, indifferent to her plight. She thought of her father, of how proud he'd been when she'd announced her intention to bring her nursing skills to the frontier, to help the settlers who had no access to proper medical care. She thought of the life she'd imagined for herself, the good she'd hoped to do, and now she was going to die out here, alone in this hostile wilderness, either at the hands of a treacherous cowboy or from exposure to the merciless elements. She'd heard the stories of what happened to people lost in this country, how the sun could kill you during the day, and the cold could finish the job at night, how thirst drove men mad before it killed them. She'd heard about the Comanche too, though those stories were often exaggerated by fearful settlers. Still, the thought of running into a war party was hardly more comforting than her current situation. As if summoned by her thoughts, a sound cut through the darkness, a sound that froze her blood. It was the howl of a coyote. Close. Too close. Then another answered it, and another. Sarah knew that coyotes rarely attacked humans, but a desperate, injured, or cornered person might be different. She was all three. She pressed harder against the rock wall, making herself as small as possible, and prayed for a miracle she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The night stretched on, each minute an eternity of fear and cold and terrible anticipation. Dawn broke over the canyon in shades of pink and gold, and Sarah opened her eyes to find herself still alive, though barely. Her body ached from spending the night pressed against cold stone, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. The coyotes had moved on sometime during the dark hours, their howls fading into the distance, replaced now by the calls of morning birds and the whisper of wind through the canyon. She forced herself to stand, her muscles protesting every movement. She had to keep moving, had to find water, or she would die out here regardless of whether Jack Mercer found her. Sarah stumbled forward, following the canyon as it twisted deeper into the wilderness, away from the wagon, away from any hope of rescue. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose with alarming speed, turning the canyon into an oven of red rock and merciless heat. By midday, Sarah was delirious. She saw mirages shimmering in the distance, pools of water that vanished when she approached them. Her tongue felt swollen in her mouth, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. She collapsed against a boulder, unable to go any further, her green eyes staring unseeing at the cloudless sky above. This was how it would end, she thought distantly. Not in a hospital bed surrounded by loved ones, but alone in the Texas wilderness, her bones picked clean by scavengers, another cautionary tale about the dangers of the frontier. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching. didn't register the massive shadow that fell across her until a hand, large and calloused, touched her shoulder. Sarah's eyes flew open, and she tried to scream, but no sound emerged from her parched throat. She found herself looking up at a man unlike any she had ever seen. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke, and arms thick with muscle. His skin was bronzed by the sun, and his long black hair hung past his shoulders, held back by a strip of leather. His face was striking, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes so dark they appeared black in the harsh sunlight. He wore buckskin leggings and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork, and at his side hung a knife in a beaded sheath. This was a Comanche warrior, and by all the stories Sarah had heard, she should have been terrified. But something in his eyes, something in the way he knelt beside her with careful gentleness despite his imposing size, made her feel inexplicably safe. He spoke in a language she didn't understand, his voice deep and resonant. When she didn't respond, he reached for a water skin at his belt and held it to her lips. Sarah drank greedily, the water like salvation flowing down her throat. He pulled it away before she could make herself sick, speaking again in that unfamiliar tongue, his tone gentle but firm. "I don't understand," Sarah croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, I need help." The warrior studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in her torn dress, her scraped arms, the desperation written across her face. He seemed to come to a decision. Standing, he lifted Sarah as though she weighed nothing at all, cradling her against his broad chest. She should have been afraid, should have struggled, but exhaustion and dehydration had stripped away her ability to resist. Besides, he had given her water when he could have left her to die. That had to mean something. He carried her through the canyon with sure steps, navigating terrain that would have been treacherous for someone on foot. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid strength of his arms, and the surprising gentleness with which he held her. When she woke fully, she found herself in a small cave, sheltered from the brutal sun. The warrior was building a fire, his movements efficient and practiced. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "You saved my life." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw him smile. It transformed his face from severe to almost beautiful, softening the hard lines and making him look younger than she'd first thought. He was perhaps 28 or 30, though it was hard to tell. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "Tachawika." Then he pointed to her, his expression questioning. "Sarah," she replied, touching her chest. "Sarah Bennett." He repeated her name slowly, the syllables strange on his tongue. "Sa-ra." Then he offered her more water and a piece of dried meat from his pack. She ate slowly, careful not to overwhelm her empty stomach. As her strength began to return, Sarah studied her rescuer more carefully. Everything about him spoke of power and capability, from the way he moved to the calm confidence in his eyes. But there was also kindness there, a quality she hadn't expected to find. Tachawika spoke again, and though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she recognized the questioning tone. She tried to explain through gestures, pointing back the way they'd come, miming riding in a wagon, then showing fear and running. His expression darkened as he understood, and he asked what sounded like a question, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "Yes, there was a man," Sarah confirmed, even knowing he likely couldn't understand her words. "Jack Mercer. He brought me out here to rob me, maybe worse. I ran away, got lost." She felt tears burning in her eyes, the terror of the previous night rushing back. "I thought I was going to die." Tachawika moved closer, and with surprising gentleness, he wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. He spoke softly, the tone clearly meant to comfort even if she couldn't comprehend the language. Then he stood and gestured for her to rest, indicating that he would keep watch. Sarah wanted to protest, to say that she was fine, but exhaustion pulled at her like a weight. Within moments of closing her eyes, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the sun was lower in the sky, painting the cave entrance in shades of amber. Tachawika sat near the opening, working on something with his hands. As Sarah sat up, he turned and showed her what he'd made, a pair of sturdy moccasins fashioned from spare leather. He gestured to her ruined boots, then offered the moccasins. Sarah removed her boots and slipped on the moccasins, finding them surprisingly comfortable. She smiled at him, genuine warmth flooding through her. "Thank you," she said again. "You're very kind." Over the next hours, as they shared a simple meal and waited for the coolest part of the day to travel, Sarah and Tachawicca began to communicate in a mixture of gestures, expressions, and single words. She learned that he had been hunting alone when he'd found her, that his people's camp was 2 days' journey to the north, and that he intended to take her there where she would be safe. She tried to explain about Fredericksburg, about her mission to bring medical supplies, but the concept was too complex for their limited means of communication. What surprised Sarah most was how comfortable she felt with this man, who should have been her enemy, according to everything she'd been taught. The settlers spoke of the Comanche as savage raiders, bloodthirsty warriors who showed no mercy, but Tachawicca showed her nothing but gentleness and respect. He never touched her inappropriately, never looked at her with anything other than concern and, increasingly, something that might have been admiration. As evening approached, Tachawicca indicated they should move. He fashioned a sling from leather to carry their supplies, then led Sarah out of the cave and into the cooling desert. They walked through the night, stopping frequently so Sarah could rest. He was patient, never showing frustration at her slower pace, always ready with water or a steadying hand when the terrain grew difficult. During one of their rest stops, Sarah found herself studying Tachawicca's profile in the moonlight. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with conventional features, and everything to do with the strength and character written in every line of his face. She thought about how he'd saved her without hesitation, how he'd cared for her with a tenderness that belied his warrior's exterior, how safe she felt in his presence despite every reason she should feel otherwise. "Who are you really?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Why did you help me?" Tachawicca turned to look at her, and in his eyes Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. It was the same thing she felt growing in her own heart, impossible and undeniable. Attraction, yes, but more than that. Recognition, as though they were two souls who had been searching without knowing what they sought, only to find it in the most unexpected place. He reached out and gently touched her face, his large hand cupping her cheek with infinite care. Sarah leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. When she opened them again, Tachawicca was smiling that transformative smile, and she smiled back, feeling something shift between them, something profound and irreversible. They continued through the night, but now Sarah was aware of every accidental touch, every glance, every moment their eyes met. The desert around them seemed less hostile, the stars above more beautiful. She was falling for this man who had saved her life, this Comanche warrior who defied everything she thought she knew about the world. As dawn broke on their second day together, Tachawicca led Sarah to a hidden spring in a sheltered canyon. While she washed the dust from her face and arms, he kept watch, his tall frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Sarah watched him, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next, her life had changed forever. They had been traveling for 3 hours when Tachawicca suddenly stopped, his body tensing like a drawn bowstring. Sarah froze beside him, following his gaze to where dust rose in the distance. Riders, at least 2 of them, moving fast across the desert floor. Tachawicca pulled Sarah behind a cluster of rocks and peered out carefully. His expression darkened, and he spoke a single word that Sarah had learned meant danger. Through the shimmering heat, Sarah could make out the lead rider, and her blood ran cold. Jack Mercer, still hunting her, still determined to claim his prize. With him rode another man, equally rough-looking, probably someone he'd recruited to help track her down. They were heading in the wrong direction for now, but it was only a matter of time before they picked up the trail. Tachawicca turned to Sarah, and in his eyes she saw determination mixed with something fierce and protective. He gestured for her to stay hidden, then pointed to himself and made a motion that clearly indicated he would deal with the threat. Sarah grabbed his arm, shaking her head frantically. "No, there are 2 of them, both armed with guns. It's too dangerous," she pleaded, knowing he couldn't understand her words but hoping her tone would convey the meaning. "Please, let's just hide until they pass." But Tachawicca gently removed her hand from his arm and spoke firmly, his deep voice leaving no room for argument. He touched her face once more, a gesture that had become familiar between them, then slipped away with the silence of a shadow. Sarah watched him go, her heart pounding with fear, Not for herself, but for this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. She watched from her hiding place as Tachawicca circled around, using the terrain with expert knowledge. He moved from boulder to boulder, invisible to the riders who continued their search. Sarah held her breath as Jack and his companion dismounted near a small ravine, examining the ground for tracks. They were close enough now that she could hear their voices carrying on the wind. "She can't have gotten far on foot," Jack was saying, his voice hard with frustration. "Probably dead already from thirst or snakes. But I want to be sure. Those supplies are worth too much to leave to chance." "And the girl?" the other man asked, a leering quality to his voice that made Sarah's skin crawl. "If she's still alive, she'll wish she wasn't by the time we're done," Jack replied with a cruel laugh. "She caused me too much trouble to just let her die easy." Sarah's hands clenched into fists, rage momentarily overcoming her fear. But before she could process what happened next, Tachawicca moved. He emerged from cover like a force of nature, his massive frame covering the distance to the two men with shocking speed. Jack barely had time to reach for his pistol before Tachawicca's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling backward into the dust. The second man managed to draw his weapon, but Tachawicca was already moving. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted, the crack of breaking bone audible even from Sarah's position. The gun fell to the ground, and Tachawicca followed up with a devastating blow to the man's stomach that left him gasping and crumpled on the ground. Jack scrambled for his fallen pistol, his hand closing around the grip. "You savage son of a—" he started, bringing the weapon up. But Tachawicca was faster, his foot connected with Jack's hand, sending the pistol flying through the air. Then he hauled Jack up by his shirt front, lifting the smaller man completely off his feet as though he weighed nothing. Tachawicca spoke in Comanche, his voice like thunder, each word dripping with controlled fury. Jack's face paled as he dangled in the warrior's grip, all his bravado evaporating in the face of this giant's wrath. Tachawicca shook him once, hard, then threw him to the ground beside his groaning companion. He picked up both pistols, emptied the ammunition, and tossed the useless weapons far into the desert. Sarah emerged from hiding, unable to stay back any longer. When Jack saw her, his eyes widened with a mixture of fear and hatred. "You think you're saved?" he spat, blood running from his split lip. "You're with a Comanche now. You're as good as dead, or worse." "He saved my life," Sarah said coldly, walking to stand beside Tachawicca, "which is more than you ever intended to do. You were supposed to protect me, and instead you tried to rob me and worse. I hope you rot for what you planned." Tachawicca seemed to understand the exchange even without knowing the words. He gestured sharply at the two men, then pointed south, away from his people's territory. The meaning was clear: leave now or face worse consequences. Jack and his companion scrambled to their feet, supporting each other as they limped toward their horses. The second man's wrist hung at an unnatural angle, and Jack's jaw was already swelling grotesquely. "Your father will hear about this," Jack called back as he struggled into his saddle. "Everyone will know you ran off with a savage." "Tell them whatever you like," Sarah replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Tell them you abandoned me to die. Tell them a Comanche warrior had more honor in his smallest finger than you have in your entire body. Tell them I'm alive because of him, not despite him." She watched as the two men rode away, disappearing into the heat shimmer on the horizon. Only when they were completely out of sight did Sarah realize she was shaking. Tachawicca turned to her, concern immediate on his face. He pulled her gently into his arms, and Sarah let herself collapse against his broad chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They stood like that for a long moment, and Sarah felt something shift between them again, deepening into something undeniable. She pulled back just enough to look up at his face, and what she saw there took her breath away. In his dark eyes was everything she felt reflected back at her: respect, admiration, protectiveness, and something deeper, something that transcended language and culture and all the barriers that should have kept them apart. Tachawicca spoke softly, his hand coming up to cup her face. Sarah didn't need to understand the words to know what he was saying. She reached up and placed her hand over his, leaning into his touch. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I don't know how it's possible, but I do." He smiled then, that beautiful smile that transformed his face, and slowly, Giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head toward hers. Sarah rose on her toes to meet him, and their lips touched in a kiss that felt like coming home. It was gentle at first, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Then it deepened, weeks of loneliness and fear and desperate hope pouring into that single connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Tachawicca touched his forehead to hers, speaking softly in Comanche. Sarah didn't need a translation. Some things were universal. He took her hand and placed it over his heart, then took her other hand and did the same. The message was clear. You are in my heart. Sarah repeated the gesture, placing his large hand over her own heart. And you are in mine, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how we'll make this work, but I want to try. I want to be with you. Over the next hours, as they retrieved the wagon that Jack had abandoned and the precious medical supplies it contained, Sarah and Tachawicca communicated more deeply than language alone could have allowed. Through gestures and expressions, through touches and glances, they began to plan a future together. Tachawicca indicated his people's camp to the north, then made gestures that Sarah interpreted as an invitation. He wanted her to come with him, to meet his people, to be part of his world. But Sarah thought of the supplies, of the sick people waiting in Fredericksburg who needed these medicines. She tried to explain, pointing to the wagon, then to the south where the settlement lay. Understanding dawned in Tachawicca's eyes, followed by something that looked like resignation. He thought she was choosing her people over him, choosing duty over love. Sarah saw the pain flash across his face and immediately grabbed both his hands, shaking her head frantically. No, that's not what I mean, she said urgently. She pointed to the wagon, made a motion of traveling south, then grabbed his hand and pulled it to her heart again, making it clear he should come with her. Come with me. Help me deliver these supplies. Then we can decide together what comes next. Both of us. Together. Tachawicca studied her face for a long moment, searching for certainty. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly, then more firmly. He would go with her to Fredericksburg, would face the settlement of white people who might see him as an enemy, because she asked it of him, because what they had found together was worth the risk. They traveled south together, Tachawicca driving the wagon with surprising skill while Sarah sat beside him. They made good time, and as they drew closer to Fredericksburg, Sarah's anxiety grew. She knew how the settlers would react to seeing her arrive with a Comanche warrior. She knew the prejudice they would face, the difficulties ahead of them. But every time doubt crept in, she would look at Tachawicca's strong profile, would remember how he'd saved her life without hesitation, how he'd protected her and cared for her and fought for her,